Good evening, everyone. I am your host, the Historian of Horror, and I welcome you to the year 1896. Before we dive into the first horror film to grace the silver screen, we should begin by talking about the man behind the camera and one of the most influential directors in history. I am talking about Georges Méliès, a name that unfortunately very few people recognize. Yet without him, we would not have the genre that we know and love. Marie-Georges Jean Méliès, commonly known as Georges Méliès, is one of the major pioneers in the film industry and helped shape the horror genre from the beginning. Born in December 1861, Georges was a French illusionist and director who directed more than 500 films in his storied career. He began his filmmaking career in May of 1896, and by the end of the year, he had founded the Star Film Company. During his time, Georges invented and perfected numerous special effects that became staples for the film industry. Georges' most famous techniques included substitution splices, multiple exposures, time-lapse photography, and dissolves. The majority of these techniques were born out of accidents and experimentation with the equipment. According to Méliès' memoirs, the substitution trick was discovered when his camera jammed in the middle of a take, and a Madeleine Bastille bus changed into a hearse and women changed into men. This same stop trick effect had already been used by Thomas Edison when depicting a decapitation in The Execution of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. However, Méliès' discovery was a matter of coincidence and not thievery. The first use of this newfound effect can be viewed in The Vanishing Lady, which we will discuss a little later in the video. Georges' most well-known film is the 1902 classic A Trip to the Moon, in which he displays a masterful understanding of special effects and storytelling. The film depicts a group of astronauts flying to the moon only to be attacked by aliens and forced to return to Earth. It was truly a masterpiece for its time and paved the way for future filmmakers. Georges may be known for sci-fi and fantasy films, but he also had a heavy hand in shaping the horror genre, or at least helping provide the tools needed to scare audiences. If you watch most of Georges' horror films today, they come off as more comedic and illusion-based trick performances, such as objects disappearing or changing size, versus the typical horror that we are accustomed to. However, you should keep in mind that audiences in the late 1800s and early 1900s had no references before this, so to them, seeing a giant bug, a skeleton, or the devil on film was terrifying. The majority of Georges' films were focused on the special effects, and they were essentially devoid of plot. So, with that brief history of such an incredible and inventive director, let's move on to the first horror films in cinema history. 1896 had 4 known horror films that I will be discussing, with all 4 directed by none other than Georges Méliès himself. So, let's take a look. Manoir du Diable, or The House of the Devil, is also known as The Haunted Castle in the US and The Devil's Castle in the UK. This is a 2-minute long film directed by Méliès and was considered lost until 1988, when a copy was found in the New Zealand Film Archive. The film tells the story of an encounter with the devil and various other supernatural entities. The film contains many traditional pantomime elements and was intentionally meant to amuse people, rather than frighten them. However, due to the nature of the subject, and because it includes a transformation involving a bat, skeletons, ghosts, and the devil himself, it is commonly referred to as the first true horror film. The Haunted Castle is also commonly considered the first vampire film, due to the bat transformation and the fact that the devil creature is banished with a crucifix. Although this is quite goofy and slightly choppy, it remains an interesting film. Considering the time, this is still impressive today. Next up from Méliès we have Une Nuit Terrible, aka A Terrible Night. This film depicts a man trying to get some sleep, played by Méliès himself, and he is continually interrupted by a giant bug. I only mention this film because many people do consider this a horror film. However, personally, I think of this more as a comedy. But I guess the image of a giant bug, no matter how it looks, could scare some audience members, so I had to mention it here. Next, we have Conjuring a Lady at Robert Houdin's, aka The Vanishing Lady. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, this is the first known use of the substitution slice. And this film is really nothing more than a simple trick that involves a vanishing woman. The big surprise is that the magician reveals a skeleton in place of the assistant, and then brings her back alive and well. Méliès would have many films similar to this one, with the sole intent of displaying a new camera technique. Finally, we come to the last horror film of this year, once again directed by Méliès, with A Nightmare. This film focuses on a man who is struggling with his nightmares that begin innocently enough with a woman at the end of his bed. This film captures a lot of Méliès' signatures, such as a dark sense of humor, an intricate painted background, and a mechanized set pieces, and of course the substitution splices. Once again, this is a film that's played for humor, but the image of that moon biting the man's hand, I guess that really could be considered horror. Well, that's it for 1896. Come back for the next episode where I will be diving into 1897 as the UK joins the race with some horror films of their own.